Hey everyone! It's been said that every quilt tells a story, and it's so true. But I also believe every quilter has a story to tell. I wanted to hear about the people behind these wonderful quilts and thought you'd enjoy hearing about their lives also. Welcome to A Quilter's Life. Marilyn Parks was able to make treasured gifts, along with her sister, from partially pieced quilts that had long been forgotten. That is just part of this incredible quilter's life. Thank you so much, Marilyn, for chatting with me on A Quilter's Life.
Well, thank you for asking me. I feel really honored that you did. And I hope I can live up to my sister-in-law's opinion of me.
If people have listened to Victoria Garton's episode, they'll know that she thinks that you're the Martha Stewart of quilting.
That's so funny.
So let's start with, where were you born and raised?
Actually, I was born in West Virginia. And when I was 2 years old, my mom and dad moved to Ohio so that my dad could get a better job. Near Youngstown, Ohio.
Okay.
Far, like northeastern Ohio.
Uh-huh.
And we lived there until 1969 when I went away to college.
And where did you go to college?
I went to Ohio Valley University in Parkersburg, West Virginia.
I had a son that went there, so I know.
Oh, really?
I know where that is. Yes.
Oh, that's very interesting. That's where I met my husband.
Uh-huh.
He grew up. Of course, he's Victoria's brother, and they grew up in Marietta. And I met him at school in Parkersburg.
Neat. It's a good school.
It really is. I got a good education there for the 2 years, but it was only a junior college at that point.
Okay. And then where did you go?
Well, after we were married, I did not go on to school right away. It took me 20 years to get back and finish my education. But we lived in western Pennsylvania. We lived in Fairmont, West Virginia. Then we moved back to Piketon, Ohio, and Elyria, Ohio, and finally in 1987 we moved to Waterford, Michigan, which is a northwest suburb of Detroit, and we spent 28 years there.
Wow.
And after 20 years, we had both retired, and most of my family had moved to the Phoenix, Arizona area by that time, and I had spent 40 years plus away from my family, so we decided to move out here for retirement.
Cool. It's good to be close to family.
It is wonderful, and I have 4 wonderful sisters, and I really missed. And I have a wonderful brother too, but sisters are different. And I think in many ways, I was closer to them, even than my brother. And my brother lives here also, so I only have one sister left back in Ohio.
She's a quilter also.
She is a quilter also, and one of my sisters here is a very big-time quilter as well. We love being together and talking about our projects and working together on our projects, and it's just really fun to have someone who really understands where you're coming from.
Uh-huh. So you said you didn't finish your education for 20 years. I'm assuming you were raising your family.
Yes, we have one son, and so that was part of it. My husband is a minister, and I don't know if you're familiar with that, but sometimes, you don't go into it because you're going to become wealthy. And so during a lot of that time, I was, working part-time jobs and as well as taking care of our son. And it just wasn't a priority in my life at that point. And while we lived in Michigan, a young woman who was a member of our congregation we had some pretty significant mental health issues, and David just wanted me to spend time with her and, see what to do to help her.
Mm-hmm.
And in the course of that, I got in way, way over my head. It was someone who needed very well-qualified professional help, and I just wasn't able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So I was able to get her referred to a therapist. But in the meantime, one of the Christian colleges nearby, it's now Rochester University, had decided to start a counseling program. And I thought, well, I'm not ever going to get in this situation again, so I'm going to enroll in their counseling program. And so I did, and I was able to finish my degree in about under 3 years.
Wow. It's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work, but I had a lot of support at home. Our son was finishing up high school. Husband was totally behind me doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And it was one of the best things I ever did.
So you started in the career of counseling.
Well, that was my intention. I actually thought of going on to graduate school, and in the meantime, I had done an internship at a continuing care retirement community in the nursing home in particular. And there were some changes there about shortly after I graduated, and they called and asked me if I would accept a position as a social worker.
Oh.
And at that time, well, let me back up. So I went to work with another social worker in the nursing home. There had been some changes in the regulation and everything. They needed more than one person in the department.
Mm-hmm.
Well, shortly after I went to work there, that person took another position somewhere else. So they asked me to be director of social services in the nursing home. And I spent almost 20 years there.
Looked like the Lord just opened the door for you.
I really felt like, in so many regards, it was a faith-based organization, so it was something that I was very comfortable with. It was a really, and it still is, a very top-rated facility, and they've expanded into assisted living, and they have subsidized independent living, and it's just a really good facility with a great reputation and wonderful people to work with. It was a good experience for me. But after so many years, I was ready to move on, so I decided to retire. And so I did, and a couple of years later, my husband was ready, and he retired, and that's when we moved to Arizona. And I stayed retired. After 7 months, our minister at the church we belong to here took a job in another state, and my husband unretired. And so he's worked full-time and part-time during the 4 years that we've lived here.
Yeah, it's hard to quit working, isn't it?
I think more so for men than it is for women. I really am not having a hard time retired at all. I have no desire whatsoever to go back to work anywhere, because now I'm doing the things that I had to defer for so many years.
Yeah.
I spend a lot of time with my sisters, and I just enjoy being at home and doing things like that. We've also started RVing when he can get away from work, and that's another thing that we really enjoy.
What areas do you like to go to?
Well, actually, we've only been doing it for about a year, so we've spent most of our time in Arizona, going around different places in Arizona. This summer, our RV was in Sholo, which is in the White Mountains of northeast Arizona. And so we went back and forth during the summer.
Mm-hmm.
When we needed to, we would come in town and stay for a week or so, and then we would go back up there and spend the time where it's cooler, a lot cooler.
Yeah. I want to go out there a little bit. I was surprised at how hot it was down in Kingman, and then we went up the mountain, and there was snow. you don't expect that when you go out to the desert.
It's totally different. Last winter there was snow up around Prescott, which is between here and Flagstaff. In I think it was in February or March, and my husband decided he'd go see the snow. And of course, the desert flowers were starting to bloom down here by that time. So we drove up and watched people. The highway sign said, "Don't stop on the highway to play in the snow." And we would see cars over on the side roads, and people were out in this little dab of snow building snowmen and taking pictures with their children. And so for us, with having lived back east most of our lives, it was really hysterical.
Yeah.
But we drove for a few miles, and David said, "Okay, I've seen enough. Let's go home."
Okay, my next question is, besides quilting, what other crafts do you do?
I have done and will do almost anything, I think. My mother loved to do any kind of crafty things, and so I think maybe that's one of the reasons that I like to do things like that. She bought me an embroidery kit when I was 5 years old, a sampler, and that was my first thing that I did. And later, back in the 80s, I got into counted cross stitch, and I did a lot of that. She taught me to knit and crochet. I work with an organization called Owl Love You Forever. It's a group that provides boxes to the hospitals with supplies in them to help comfort moms whose babies are stillborn or die shortly after birth.
Yeah.
And so I crochet little boy hats to go in those boxes. And also I sew receiving blankets that go in the boxes. There's a full-size blanket, and then there's a miniature size, so mom can wrap her baby in one and have the others a keepsake. They're exactly alike, just size difference. So that's my crocheting. I have done scrapbooking. I've done garment sewing. I do fabric dyeing. I dabble a little bit with watercolor. And I'm sure I've done other things that I don't remember right now, because I'll try about anything.
You mentioned the watercolor. I'm wondering, it seems like several quilters have liked painting and watercolors. And I'm wondering if it's even in quilting, picking out fabric that equates some with being able to pick out colors that go well on a watercolor.
I think, yeah, there's definitely an overlap there. And I'm just attracted to bright, happy, colorful things, period. And I never would have dreamed to even attempt watercolor because I'm not artistic in that sense. But one of my sisters had started to watercolor, and she encouraged me to try it. And we actually, last winter, I left warm weather in Arizona and went back to Ohio, and we had a watercolor and quilt retreat that week. So she's really been great to encourage me on things like that. And she'll go along with my harebrained ideas. Like I said, I wanted to dye fabric for quilts, and she was someone who didn't poo-poo the idea and got right into it with me. And so she's very involved in fabric dyeing as well.
Oh, how fun. Do you do that more often now, or did you just try it the once?
No, periodically we both do it. I helped her with a king-size quilt, I think it was, that she wanted to dye a back for. And this is February, and it's snowy and cold outside. We worked in her little bitty laundry room and managed to dye a quilt back that she really likes a lot.
Wow.
And more recently, she's experimenting and looking for specific colors and trying to find out, well, if I do this, what happens? Or if I do that, what happens? And so she's just completed a quilt top all of recently hand-dyed fabrics. I also work with a group. It's a faith-based character building group called American Heritage Girls. And we found that our biggest budgetary item last year was disposable tablecloths. And so we talked about it and decided that I knew where I could buy fabric by the bolt that was relatively inexpensive to dye. And so that was one of their projects last summer. They came over one day and we dyed tablecloths. So, and I have some things I want to do in the near future. I need a quilt back myself, so I'll probably do that in the next few weeks or so. It goes off just a little bit more outside, so it's easier to work.
I've just heard a little bit about dyeing fabric, and it does sound complicated.
I do only cotton, and I use a fiber reactive dye. It interacts with the fibers and becomes permanent, and you have to put some chemicals in it to cause it to do that. And then you have to soak it for a very long time to make sure all of the excess dye is washed out so that it doesn't fade. But once it's not that complex, there's a lot of room for experimentation and it will still work. But there's some great materials out there to help you learn how to do it. I'm big on the internet. No matter what I try to do, I use the internet a lot, and there are tutorials online. There's some great books out there that explain how to do these things. So I've relied on that. And then just like my sister says, well, I'm going to try this and see what happens. I usually use fat quarters or fat eighths, and I buy 108-inch wide fabric by the bolt, and I think it costs me something like $18 for 15 yards. So, I'm not talking a huge investment.
No. That's really neat. So are there any other hobbies like even baking, cooking, bicycling, other hobbies you do?
Actually, I don't do much in the way of physical stuff. My balance is so bad. I got a new bicycle a couple of years ago, and my balance is so bad I couldn't even hold it upright. So that's a bad thing about getting older, I guess. But I love to cook. Always have. My mother taught me from the time I was 5, the first time and you have to see this in quotation marks, baked cookies. And she put up with a lot of messes in the kitchen so that we could learn. And every single one of us, including my brother, are good cooks. And so we certainly enjoy our food, and we enjoy cooking together as well.
Neat. It sounds like 5 was a busy year for you. You said you got an embroidery kit and you learned to cook.
Yes. My mother was very patient because at that time she had 4 children. So, that was a lot to take on working with me. But she was wonderful about doing that. Something else that also happened at that same age, I think that's when I first really got interested in quilt making. Quilts were a huge part of our lives. We didn't have blankets, we had quilts. And both my grandmothers quilted, my mother quilted. So, that part's been a big deal. But when I was 5, my mother actually bought red and white new fabric. Usually she had quilted with feed sacks. And she bought enough to make a quilt. And she made a Dutchman's puzzle. I don't know if you're familiar with that pattern or not.
No, I don't think so.
A lot of half-square triangles, and it's the way they're arranged. It's an interesting pattern. It was all red and white. And she would chain piece the pieces through the machine, and she let me sit on a stool behind the treadle machine, and I snipped those pieces apart as they came through the machine.
What a neat idea. I never thought about putting the kid on the other side.
And I thought I was hot stuff, let me tell you.
That would be so helpful. I bet you were a huge help to her and you didn't realize it.
Well, it may have been she just wanted something to keep me busy to keep her out her hair, too. But I've never forgotten that. And actually, my sister in Ohio has that quilt still.
Oh, wow. What a great memory.
Oh, it is. It is. It's one of our prized possessions.
Mhm. So I'm assuming that your mom introduced you to quilting?
Yes, she did. She did. She didn't have a lot of time because eventually there were 6 children. So she didn't have a lot of time, but she always worked at it a little bit whenever she had some free time, and especially in the winter. We had a huge garden, and she canned and froze all summer, but then in the winter she would have time to do some quilting. And in later years, my maternal grandmother, she'd had a fall on the ice in West Virginia, and it just wasn't safe for her to stay alone all winter anymore.
Yeah.
And so she would come to Ohio and spend a few weeks with each of her children. And when she was at our house, she and my mother always quilted together.
Wow.
And in fact, about 7 or 8 years ago, well, let me back up just a little bit.
Yeah.
My parents died in a car accident in 1969. And friends of theirs took in the 6 of us. I was in college by that time. And took care of us until we were grown. They, a few years later, moved to Arizona. And we didn't realize until about 5 or 6 years ago, maybe, she found 2 partially pieced quilt tops that she had stored away and forgotten about for all those years.
Uh-huh.
And so she pulled them out and called one of my sisters who then lived here and asked her if she could make something out of those 2 pieces of quilt so that each one of us could have some of it, because it was something that our mother had made.
Yeah.
So my sister then called me, and at that time I was spending a couple of weeks at a time out here. We had bought a home out here. And so we got together, and one of the quilt tops was just squares that was pieced out of just whatever. There was do you remember whipped cream fabric that we had blouses out of back in the 60s? It was like a lightweight polyester blouse type fabric. And often it was a little crepey. Okay, had a little bit of a crepey look to it. So it wasn't quilt fabric by any means. And there were feed sacks, and there were pieces of garment fabric. It was just whatever she had, she and my grandmother had put together and made this piece. And it was about the size probably of a full-size quilt. Well, the other piece was hexagons, and they had used cardboard templates and hand-pieced it, and it was less than perfect, shall we say. Pretty, but less than perfect. So my sister and I looked at those, and we tried and tried and tried to figure out what on earth are we going to do to get 6 quilts out of these 2. So we finally decided that if we added a border to the squares, that we could get 4 quilts out of that. And we could not get the hexagons to lay flat at all.
Oh.
So we finally decided, well, if we iron a fusible interfacing to them, we can cut squares and sew the squares together and put a border on them. We can get 2 more. So that's what we did. So Barbara, who had been our guardian, had intended these quilts as Christmas gifts for all of us. So we made the quilts, finished them up, had them long-arm quilted. We got together and sewed bindings on by hand, and then we took them and wrapped them for Barbara. And on my mother's birthday, we were all in town. It happened to be my husband's birthday, too. And we invited everyone to my house to celebrate my husband's birthday and asked them to keep the afternoon free, and told them that we had an excursion that we were going on. So we drove across town, and these quilts were presented to everyone. And we got to choose a box. No one knew what you were getting until you opened your box. Because otherwise, different quilts that were totally different. And
how neat that you were all together to do that.
It really was. It really was. And I made labels on them that indicated that they were by our mother and preserved by Barbara and assembled by Andrea and Marilyn, that kind of thing. So, it's a real commemorative thing of our mother.
Yeah.
So it's the house and see the quilt laying on the sofa or someone cuddling under it, that kind of thing. And we've really enjoyed those, and it's a great memory of our mom.
Oh, yeah. Such a neat story.
It's a meaningful one to us. Things like that don't mean as much to other people, but quilts are items, I think, at least in my mind, that do stir up a lot of memories. As we looked through those, we each found pieces of things we had worn, clothing that we had made, and that brought back a lot of memories as well.
Oh, yeah. You think a lot of those things that you had worn, were the materials taken from the clothes, or were they left over? Had your mom make the clothes for you?
They were leftover things that from things she had made clothes of. There were some things that I had sewn when I was in home ec classes in high school. I remember there was a lavender and white gingham that I had made a nightgown of. Dresses that Mom had made for me. There was one that had it was white background with red hearts, and she had made it for my 7th birthday. And there were things that my sisters recognized that they had worn as well.
That is so neat. The more you talk about it, the more it's just getting like, wow.
Well, it's nice that somebody else would react that way. Kind of gave us goosebumps.
Yeah. I'm so glad you have that. I feel like I'm using the same words over and over again. It's so neat. It's so great. But it is. It is. It's really cool.
And there are other quilts around too that my mother made. That various ones of them have. I have one that my maternal grandmother made up for me as a graduation gift when I graduated from high school. And it's no one else would think it was real special. The techniques were not the best or anything, but she was getting elderly at that point, and she had always had to make do. The quilts that I grew up with were all utility quilts.
Yeah.
In the truest sense. And I found it very moving that she cared enough about to make something to give to me. I wasn't looking at how it was made or anything like that.
Right.
I loved it because of where it came from.
Right. And I think as quilters, we know when we make something for someone else that our mind is on that person, and knowing that she was thinking of you making that for you is just wonderful. Mm-hmm. So out of the quilts that you have made, do you have a favorite?
Oh, my. A favorite. Actually, I guess, write this and then I can't say I have a single favorite, but one right now that I would list as one of my favorites is a sampler quilt that I finished last year. I had started it like 5 years ago. It's from a Lori Holt pattern called Farm Girl Vintage.
Okay.
And there's 6-inch blocks and they're bright, cheery colors. She grew up on a farm, and so it has her grandmother was a quilter, and I think in many regards her upbringing was similar to mine probably. And she references all of those things in her patterns and in the things that she writes about her patterns. And so that's probably one of my favorites right now. And actually, she's just come out with Farm Girl Vintage too. And my new book is supposed to be delivered tomorrow, and I can't wait.
Now, what was that designer's name?
Lori Holt, Lori. The last name is Holt. And she lives in Utah, Mm-hmm. And she absolutely writes the best patterns I've ever seen because they're very intricate, small pieces, but she tells you exactly what size to cut them. And then when you sew two pieces together, she tells you exactly what that unit should measure. So if you have an accurate seam allowance and you've trimmed your block correctly, those little 6-inch blocks will go together just perfect. And she's the only quilter I've ever seen who really goes into that much detail.
Do you usually like to use someone's pattern, or do you like times making up your own?
No, not so much making my own, no. I kind of like more intricate things. Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to try and reinvent the wheel on that. I've always loved the Judy Niemeyer quilts. Are you familiar with her?
No, what's her name again?
Judy Niemeyer. You have to take a class to really learn how to do it. It's paper pieced, but she has her own technique, and she's known for those sharp floating points. A lot of quilt shops, you have to be certified by her to teach the classes. It's that complicated.
Wow.
And I'd always loved those. And about a year ago, I was at an anniversary celebration from one of our local quilt shops and dropped my name in the hat, and I drew out a free Judy Niemeyer class. So I took that this year, and I love doing things like that. And it turns, she has special techniques for everything. And like it's a star finish, and you do it in quarters, and there's a corner, it's round, and then the corner has a piece that's rounded, and you have to sew those two pieces together. It's an inside and an outside curve. And when you follow her technique, it comes out absolutely perfect. I like things like that.
Yeah.
I don't want to have to fiddle and figure it out. Hanging on my wall right now that I had made 6 blocks of. I'm the 4th owner, at least, of this fabric. And it's a twisted log cabin.
I think I've heard of that, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's very different, a very different technique. And the person who designed this one didn't write the pattern very well. She had a presser foot that she was trying to sell.
Okay.
And I worked for half a day, 2 different times, and never got a single block pieced or even figured out how to do it.
Yeah.
And so this summer while we were RVing, I took it with me and I made up my mind I was going to figure it out. And I finally figured out. And it was some weird, instead of sewing on the seam, you sewed a 1/4 inch to the side of the seam, to the seam line on the paper. Well, I got 6 blocks hanging on my design wall now. So the pattern was so awful. Yeah, the instructions, the way it was written was so awful. But I'm going to master it.
Did you make notes so that you know how to do it now?
Oh, yes.
You mentioned taking it to your RV, sewing at your RV. I heard that some people that had an RV liked having that old machine that had a treadle so that they could sew while they were outside. Or what do you have set up at your RV?
Well, actually, this summer I worked inside. I think the next time I do it, I probably will work outside. But there's an electric plug right under the canopy where I would want to work. There's always a breeze where we were this summer, so it wouldn't have worked well to work outside anyway.
Yeah.
But I'm still trying to figure out the best way to do it there. And I'm partial to my modern machines. I learned to sew on a treadle, but there are things it won't do that my modern machines will.
We do get used to certain technology.
Yeah, we did. It's a nice memory, but I'm happy to leave it in memory.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite tool to work with?
I really like my machines a lot. I was thinking about that before when I was thinking about talking to you.
Uh-huh.
And I love the rotary cutters and mats and all of those things. But when it comes to something that I really use a lot that would be complicated if I didn't have it, it's actually some books that I have that I really like.
Yeah, that's a good answer.
I have one called an all-in-one quilter's reference tool. And it's published by C&T Publishing. And they have in it things that I refer to over and over and over again. I was making an extra long twin quilt for my grandson, and there are measurements in there that tell you exactly what size the mattress is and how big to make it if you want this much drop or that much drop. It tells you how to make straight binding, bias binding, and how much yardage you need to buy, different ways to lay out your backing and how much yardage you need for that. If you're cutting a specific piece, how to figure out how much yardage you need to get how many pieces you can get across a width of fabric. All of those things. What size to cut your squares if you want to make half square triangles.
Yeah.
It just, so much reference information like that. How many blocks you need if you want to set it on point or straight set, or just a ton of different things that are in that. And that probably is one of the more valuable things that I have. And another thing that I have was a gift. And it's, I mentioned Lori Holt before. She has a blog, by the way. It's called Bee in My Bonnet. And she's always doing tutorials on her blog. And with great projects. When she has a book, she often has a sew-along where she'll give you little extra special tips along the way. And she published a couple of years ago, and it's still available. It's called a Scrappy Project Planner. And it's a spiral-bound book. And I've seen quilters' planners before that are dated by month and week and year. And that didn't work for me. But this one is one where you have room to list a ton of projects in it. And you can, I think there's like 50 pages that you can do it. So you have the name and the size you're making it and the block size and when you start it and when you finish it. And you can keep track of along the way of where you are. And that has really been helpful to me. And I have a lot of UFOs.
Yeah.
And I've knocked several of them out in the last couple of years. And this book has had a lot to do with helping me plan that and accomplish it. When I moved to Arizona, I had 17 finished quilt tops hanging in the closet.
Wow.
I had a lot, yes. And I think I'm down to about 5 of those left. I finally managed to quilt the others. And I do my own machine quilting.
Okay.
So I have been trying to practice my skills and learn better ones. So what I'm doing right now is working hard on learning new quilt patterns. And I heard someone on one of your other podcasts mention Angela Walters.
Yeah.
She's an author, and she's quilted many, many award-winning quilts, and she's a wonderful teacher. She's funny, entertaining, and she did a free motion quilting challenge last year, where she had a free pattern to make a quilt to practice on, and then she demonstrated on video how to quilt each block and how to finish your quilt. So I started it over a year ago, and I'm now in the finishing stages of that top. And I have learned so much doing this. The pattern is available online. If you go to Quilting is My Therapy, that's her website. She has several free motion quilting classes, but this particular one was, I think she just called it Free Motion Quilting Challenge, I believe. And so she would release a different video each week with a new something on it. And there's a feathery flower, there are leaves, there's meandering, there are wavy lines. And that has really been a wonderful, wonderful resource for me. I've actually learned how to do wishbones.
A wishbone?
And a wishbone design is often used in straight sections of like borders or sashing. And it's like a loop on each side of the sashing. And just so many variations of those things, and the way she presents it, it's manageable. So that's probably one of the best things that I've done in a long time is to work through that class.
Were there others taking it that you got to chat with, or you just were on your own?
No, you're kind of on your own. You can ask questions of her if you want to, but it's really self-explanatory. Mm-hmm. Between the videos and the sheets that she has available that you can print out with the designs and instructions and tips for what to do. And she has a book now that has a lot of the same designs in it. I had bought the book before the class became available. It's a good reference, but I could have learned a lot of these designs just with practice because of all the information it gives you in the book as well.
Yeah. When you're working on your quilts, what's your favorite part to do?
I enjoy the piecing.
Uh-huh.
Actually, I really like it all, but I do enjoy the piecing quite a bit. Dreaming up what I want to do next, is a fun thing.
Uh-huh.
Or finding the right fabric, and I'll confess to having a fairly extensive stash. When I did my Judy Niemeyer quilts, it's all batiks and all came from my stash.
Oh wow!
So yeah, it's a problem. So recently I have been trying to finish up unfinished things and use up fabric that I've already bought. And I've been fairly successful at doing that. Although I still buy fabric.
Yeah. Do you find that you have two on hand, but you need a third one to go with it, and you have to go find that somewhere else? Or have you been able to find them all in your stash?
I can't always find everything. One quilt, the Lori Holt sampler that I did, I knew I wanted a yellow for the outside border, and I had one that would work, but it wasn't perfect. Mm-hmm. And I took it when I was going to my sister's to sew and ask her opinion on it. And she agreed that it wasn't perfect, so she went in her stash, and we swapped. She took mine and I took hers, so that way I didn't have to buy more fabric. And I didn't feel guilty using up her fabric. Another thing that I do is if I don't have it, I'll dye it. And I've done that frequently, especially for a quilt backing, because I can pick whatever color I want.
Mm-hmm.
As long as I have that color dye.
The dye's not too expensive, is it? So you probably pick up what you want.
I order it from a company in California, and you can buy different quantities of it. I use enough of it that I pretty much have whatever I want to do.
Okay.
The other thing is, if you have a few basic colors, you can mix them and get some really fun things out of it.
Yeah.
And I've done some of that before too.
Sounds like a fun experiment.
It really is. It's like working in a science lab.
What was your worst quilting experience.
Okay. Well, in sorting through my fabrics a few years ago, I realized that I had a bunch of Christmas fabrics, just odds and ends things from various Christmas craft projects. And some of them were polyester and some were cotton, and they weren't doing anyone any good. There wasn't really enough anything significant out of any one of them. And so I decided I was going to make a quilt. So I didn't wash any fabrics or anything. I just made my quilt. And it had a background that was a white-on-white fabric.
Okay.
So I got my quilt all done, and I put it in the washer. And I used Dawn dish soap to wash the excess dye out of my hand-dyed fabrics.
Okay.
So I put Dawn soap in there. That helps to suspend the dye in the water. And I ran it through the cycle, and I pulled it out, and the white was pink.
Oh, no.
Yes. From my reading online on a blog, this lady had done something, an article on Save My Bleeding Quilt. She's a fabric dyer. She sells her fabric after she dyes it.
Yeah.
And she had a customer have a serious problem with dye, and she thought, she tested and tested and had never had a problem with the dye fading before. And so she did some research on it, and she came up with a plan on how to go about getting this dye out of fabric if it bled. And so I followed everything that she said and soaked and soaked and soaked and soaked. And the dye came out of the fabric itself. The problem was the white is kind of a paint type stuff that they use to do that white on white fabric. Oh. And it stayed on the print.
Oh, no.
I was never able to get that totally out. So I now have a Christmas quilt that has a slight pink tinge in the white fabric.
Oh.
But fortunately, I didn't spend money on the fabric. It was stuff I had.
Yeah.
Leftovers.
That's so interesting about that white fabric.
I would never have known that would happen. And, the fact that it came out of the fabric itself, it was just the pattern that was printed on the fabric that it didn't come out of.
It's amazing.
Yeah. I learned. I'm not buying any more white-on-white fabric. It's pretty, but I'm not buying any more.
Yeah. I try to avoid fabrics with a lot of red in them, simply because I've heard of so many problems with them running.
Well, this gal that I got the information on getting rid of the dye that had faded, she said that even with her hand-dyed fabrics, she's realized that sometimes the dye, excess dye, won't let loose until she soaked it days.
Huh.
Often, she said, it will release if you soak it overnight. But she's had some that would still stay. I don't remember how many hours it was, but a day or two, before all of the dye would actually release into the water.
Yeah.
So I think if you're going to use deep colored fabrics like that, you need to be sure that you not just wash it, but also soak for a long time.
Huh. I was taught to not wash my fabric before making the quilt, so I usually don't. But that really makes you think when you think how long that dye could hold on to it. So do you wash all your fabric before you make a quilt normally?
No.
Oh, okay.
And I think I should probably. My problem with it, though, is you have all those frayed strings after you wash it.
Yeah.
That you've got to fight with. And then you have to iron it. And I know I should, but I just don't like fooling with it. And that's really the only time I've ever had a serious problem with fabric fading.
I think the reason they told me was, if you wash it, then you're pulling it and stuff, and it's more uniform if you don't wash it ahead of time.
Yeah, the grain is going to be straighter, I think, if you don't wash it. You have to be really careful when you press it to pull it back into shape and that kind of thing. Yeah. I used to wash garment fabric when I sewed garments. Yeah. And I remember straightening that fabric again was a royal pain.
Mhm.
I hate, that was the worst part about making clothes, was getting the fabric straight after you washed it.
Yeah. It's been a long time since I've done that, so yeah, bringing back a long memory.
Yeah, me too.
Okay, so let me ask you, why do you make quilts?
I make them as gifts, but I also make them because I enjoy the creativity of it.
Mm-hmm.
They're pretty. I have a rod in my breakfast room or my dining room, and I hang seasonal quilts on that. And there's always one on the sofa, and I have, I think, 3 in the RV, and there's one on the bed, and I have small projects hanging in my breakfast room, and I just enjoy it. I like looking at them. I like being able to give them to people. It's a fun hobby.
Mm-hmm.
There's just a lot of things. Oh, speaking of bed quilts, can I tell you another story?
Oh, please. Yes.
Okay, when I first started thinking about making quilts seriously, a friend was making quilts back in the 80s. She was an older lady that was a good friend. And, calico was the big thing then. You made calico quilts, and they were very traditional. It intrigued me, and she talked me into taking a class making a pillow. And I did, and I really enjoyed it. Well, a year or so later, we moved to Michigan, and I wasn't working any longer. And so I had time on my hands, and so I decided I'm going to make a quilt for our bed. And this was in the late 80s when the colors were mauve and green, that blue-green. Okay.
I remember.
So I bought fabric for a log cabin quilt, and I made 6-inch blocks in this log cabin for at that time, queen-size bed. And not too long after that, I got occupied with other things, and I didn't have time to work on it anymore, so I put it away in a box. And never got back to sewing it. And a friend was looking for something to hang, to decorate a big wall in her living room. And she had those colors, and I suggested to her that if she'd like, I'd give her those blocks, and she could finish it and make it into a quilt to hang on her wall.
Mm-hmm.
So I gave them to her. That would have been, I bought the fabric in 1987. I must have given it to her about maybe 10 years later, and about, 10 or so years after that, I asked for it back because she'd never done anything with it. And so I decided I am going to finish this quilt. Well, by that time, those colors were no longer popular.
Right.
And by that time, we had a king-size bed instead of a queen. So I didn't think I'd ever find colors that would go with that to enlarge the quilt. Finally, I did, enough to put a big border on it for the drop on the bed.
Yeah.
And I finished that quilt, and it's now on our bed.
Cool.
From the time I bought the fabric until the quilt was finished was exactly 25 years to the month. So there's always hope for a UFO.
Yeah. Well, if you wait long enough, something that goes out of style comes back in style.
Well, yeah, that's true. As it happened, we didn't move a lot of furniture when we came to Arizona because of the expense. So I went to resale shops, and I found a bedroom set, a chest and 2 nightstands. in that same green that's in the quilt.
Oh, neat.
So it works very well together.
Yeah. So never give up on those, huh?
Well, I even tried to give it away, and that didn't work. So I guess it's a good thing I got it back.
Who do you like to make quilts for?
Well, I think about anyone that is what Angela Walters would call quilt worthy. Not everyone in my mind is quilt worthy because they wouldn't appreciate it, or they wouldn't have no understanding of what goes into it.
Mm-hmm.
But I have given a lot of baby gifts. I've given wedding gifts. I do a lot for my sisters. I usually do some sort of a quilted project as Christmas gifts, whether a table runner or a seasonal pillow or something like that.
Yeah.
I've given a few to friends. Our church in Michigan, we did a huge building project, and we needed some things for decor. So I did an embroidered Bible story quilt for the nursery.
Yeah.
And I did another, it's kind of a contemporary wall hanging for one of the bathrooms that we needed something in. I guess it's pretty much, but a lot of them go to family for one reason or another. And then I have my seasonal quilts that I hang in my dining room that I really enjoy.
By seasonal, do you go quarterly or almost monthly?
No, I don't have quite enough to go monthly, but I have Valentine, and I have some things that are kind of springy. I have a red, white, and blue Ohio Star that usually goes up from before Memorial Day till after July 4th.
Mm-hmm.
I have an applique. It's called Falling Leaves. It's all batiks in fall colors on the wall right now.
Oh.
I have a panel, a Christmas panel that has lights on it that's quilted, and that's my Christmas tree these days. I don't know, various things like that.
Yeah.
And if I see something that I like, I'll make something new to put up.
So what are some tips that you would give to other quilters or new quilters?
I think probably, first of all, I would say figure out what it is you want, what your tolerance is for imperfection.
Mm-hmm.
For example, with my sister-in-law, Vicki, how we had a conversation last winter, and she was putting down her skills as a quilter.
Yeah.
And I think we need to be proud of what we do and do the best that we can do. And my grandmother used to say, if someone would comment on something that she had or something that she had made, she would say, and she did this even when she had dementia in the nursing home, she would say, it pleases me. And to me, if it pleases me, that's good enough. So I said to Vicki, when she was talking about her lack of skill, I said, well, what is it that you would like to do? What is it you would like to change? Mm-hmm. And she said that she would like to be more accurate and just kind of in general improve her skills. And so that's what brought about her visit when she visited last winter. We spent some time, and I showed her some things that I had learned that had improved my skills. And she seems to be very happy with the things that she's learned. But my point is, I think you need to decide what it is that you want and then work on doing that. And if it's improve your skills, then figure out how. Your quilt's going to look better if you're accurate. Okay, but how do I do that?
Yeah.
I've got to cut accurately. I've got to measure accurately. I've got to have an accurate seam allowance. And there are a lot of things out there that can help you to do that. And I think that's what's really important, is that you figure out what those things are. Find someone who can teach you. When it comes to measuring and cutting and sewing accurately, the most helpful information I ever found was on a blog called quiltville.com, and the person who writes the blog is Bonnie Hunter, and she teaches all over the world. She's written a ton of books, and she has a set blog just on tips, and I learned a ton from her on how. The best one I ever learned from her was to have an accurate seam allowance, and she has a special ruler that you measure with, and this little thing that you make out of a expired credit card, and you use that as your seam guide. It's the best one I've ever seen or ever used. And I have a totally accurate 1/4-inch seam when I use that.
Wow.
The other thing that I used to not do was I would sew my pieces together, and I didn't trim. I didn't know I needed to. Now I know, square up my block and trim it and make sure it's accurate.
Yeah.
And Bonnie says every time you sit down to sew, even using her seam guide, you take 2 pieces of fabric that you know the measurements of, you sew them together, you press your seam, and then you check to see if your unit is the size it should be. Every single time you sit down to sew.
Really?
And when I do that, I have really, really accurate piecing. And my blocks go together like a dream. And when all of my pieces are together, if I'm supposed to have a 6.5-inch block, it's a 6.5-inch block.
That's amazing.
It is. It is. And I didn't know that for years. And I got really frustrated.
I'm working on that now, so
Well, it's not something that just comes to us naturally.
Right.
I did this for years before I figured it out. Some other things that I like to do is when I was working on my Lori Holt sampler quilt, and I also did a paper-pieced 1930s farmer's wife, which some of the blocks would have as many as 80 pieces in them.
Oh,
and
wow.
it finishes, it's a 6-inch finished block.
No way,
So,
80 pieces in 6 inches?
Yes, ma'am. It was an exercise in insanity, I think. But I learned in doing those small blocks with many, many pieces, I started making kits. I would cut pieces and put them all in a little Ziploc bag, like a snack bag would hold tiny pieces, along with the paper piecing pattern, and have it labeled. And then when I got ready, I could do a session, where I might cut 8 or 10 blocks. And then as I had time, I'd pull out one baggie and piece the block. If I didn't finish it in one setting, it went back in the baggie. I had all those pieces already cut. And so I could sew a lot of blocks together in a hurry by already having it done. That was a tip that really helped me a lot.
Yeah, I'm thinking back to talking to Vicki, and she said you had made pickle jars where you put your little scraps in. I was like, no wonder you're using such tiny little scraps to make.
Well, those are the ones Vicki saw. I have boxes and boxes of scraps, and bigger pieces I've cut into either anywhere from 1.5 to 2.5-inch strips. My sister has an AccuCut Go machine, and so we'll do that. We'll get together and help each other do that. Another one I did a couple years ago, and this is a Bonnie Hunter thing. She calls it leaders and enders. You know how when you come to the end of a seam and you pull your thread out and you cut your thread and you've got that wasted thread?
Yeah.
Or some people use what they call a thread bunny, which is a scrap of fabric that they sew over so that when they start sewing again, then the thread doesn't end up down in the bobbin.
Yeah.
Well, Bonnie says that's a waste of good thread. And she's very thrifty. So she always has what she calls a leader ender project.
Yeah.
And over where she cuts out her pieces for a quilt, like she's 4-patch units, she cuts all the patches out, and then she sews 2 pieces together and then 4 pieces together, and uses that as her piece after she's sewn her current project under the needle.
Right.
And
yeah.
I pulled out scraps one year and cut a bunch of kits for one of her patterns, had them all kitted up, and used them as leader and ender. And I had a quilt together in no time at all. It was amazing. So there are lots of things you can use your scraps for. And Bonnie is known as a scrap quilter. So her quilts are all scrappy. That's why I save all my little bitty pieces.
Yeah, I'm hoping to get to that point. I've only had one project where I needed some different fabric to fill in because same pieces were going next to each other, and I was able to look through what I had and find a few pieces to put in there, so that worked out. But other than that, I haven't been too successful there.
Well, I think it does take time to come up with that many different fabrics.
Mm-hmm.
Have worked on enough projects where you have enough to do that with.
Yeah.
I have friends who de-stash and give me stuff too. Like I need more. But it is a good way to build up your supply.
Yeah. My husband's the one that's like, buy more. And I'm like, no, I'm going to use this. Well, a quilt shop here in Marietta, I don't know if you talked to Vicki, the one out on Tennis Center Drive, went out of business. So I just bought a bunch of fabric there.
Oh, okay.
But I'm still having a hard time. I usually like to figure out a pattern I want to do or who it's going to be for, and then go and pick out the fabric for that particular project. So it feels harder to me to look at what I have and try to figure out what I want to make with it.
I think especially if you want a specific quilt or a specific pattern, if you're doing something scrappy, then you might be able to find enough. But not everyone likes the scrappy style, and it doesn't suit everyone that you're giving a quilt to either.
Right. Well, I tried to buy a dark, medium, and light of things that would go together. 3 or 4, maybe 5 materials that I knew would go together. I had plenty, but the projects I want to do was still working in that order is harder for me.
I think we all have our own way of working, don't you?
Yeah.
What works for one of us doesn't necessarily work for another.
Yeah.
We just kind of have to work with the way our mind works and what we like, and we're all different. And I think it's important to recognize that. There's no right or wrong way. It's what works for us.
Right. But it seems like the people I've been giving quilts to seem to like them, so I'm thankful for that.
That's what matters. I think we need to keep our eye on what the main thing is. It makes a difference to the people that receive them, and it gives you joy to give them, and that's enough.
Yeah. Well, I so enjoyed chatting with you. Thank you so much for allowing me to call and chat with you today.
Well, you're quite welcome, and thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Hope you enjoyed this episode of A Quilter's Life. You can find more stories on aquilterslife.com or subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts so each episode will be downloaded automatically. Thanks for listening.